Proffessors is brought to you by TrollandToad.com, MTGMintCard.com, CardHorder.com, and Jiffy's Photo and Baseball Cards. Shards of Alara is here and known, and it looks extremely tasty, so have your mouse on the order button at TrollandToad.com, MTGMintCard.com, and CardHorder.com, or support the show and head on down to Jiffy's Photo and Baseball Cards today.
Hello everybody and welcome back to yet another episode of Planeswalking with the Professors. This week we're going to take a long look at the state's metagame and what it will look like in your area and some tips for playing in any constructed tournament as well. So let's draw. So states is tomorrow, and in a word, if you're a kind of person that needs a bit more playtesting than 12 hours of a Mountain Dew and Cheeto-fueled night, like I happen to be, then maybe you should have put a little more time into this before throwing $25 into the wind, like throwing $25 off a bridge or a cliff or into actually building your deck. Oh, wait a minute, you just threw the $25 off a bridge, didn't you? Didn't you? Well, for those of you with the actual IQ capable of actually playing this game and who, even if you have playtested your brains out, are willing to hear some advice, check this out. So Fairies is continuing to be as resilient as ever, while 5-color control, or cruel control, depending on what you're playing, seems to adapt as much as the world itself. There are plenty of other options. For example, the top 16 of the latest Star City Games 5K had 10 different archetypes, including the winning deck, yes, being cruel control, sporting 4 cryptic commands and 56 other cards, of course, but it also included Kithkin White Weenie, inching its way up to 2nd place, as well as 3 new deck types in the Kithkin mutations of Kithkin Backlash, Vengeant Weenie, as well as the Quill Spike combo. We also saw the incredible resilience that is Revelark, as well as Merfolk that, despite having only 4 lords, is right up there. I'd also like to give a shout out to the well-placing, but not quite getting there, River Kelpie and Mannequin variants. So, what to look out for as of now? What to play at states? And what to play to beat everything else? Well, of the 5 big decks, we'll be taking a look at these today. Cruel Control, or for that matter, just about any 5-color variant, White Weenie, Fairies, Red Deck Wins, and Elves. Well, I realize that Kithkin variants have a relatively good chance as well, and by all means are perfectly playable. The Kithkin Backlash deck much represents the matchups of the 5-color control decks, as does Revelark in their strategies, and the Vengeant Weenie, Token Aggro, and Merfolk decks operate much the same way as Elves. Beginning with the 5-color control, for which we'll take a look at Chris Walterick's list. We see that Walterick uses a pretty average build that is equipped to fight an average Fairies deck and geared for counter spells with the main deck Knucklevy, Bant Charm, Negate, and Remove Soul, and the boarded Archmage and Negate, and of course, the 4 Esper Charms to deal with the obvious issue of Bitter Blossom, and also at the end of turn card drawing engine. Among the reasons to play this deck, there are clearly the great facts that anything can be put into it, and it's a bit cheaper than Fairies if built correctly, but it is still, of course, not by any means the cheapest. It also requires quite a bit of play skill, so even if you have the cards for this, you might want to consider leaving the last minute deck to one of the pros. One of the issues with this deck is, of course, that it seems to lose to Red Deck Wins, but that's my personal deck of choice. When I picked this deck up at Regionals, I expected it to handle a bit better under the clock of an aggro deck, but I was wrong, it could not. Given thanks to my matchups against Fairies and Merfolk, I was able to top 16, I argue that. Looking back at the deck now, it needed a few less shocks and a few more Bogart Ram gangs, however. However, taking a look at the list I'm planning to play at states, I'm pretty impressed. The deck has been able to so far easily blast through 5-color controls and fairies, the 2 decks I expect to see the most out of this tournament, and as a result is running 2 Vexing Shushers in the main board and 4 Guttural responses to react against their infinity of counterspells, and the 2 main-boarded Fulminator Mage and 2 sideboarded that are primarily there to pull the rug under any and all players with reflecting pools, but can also kill a Mutavault or other manland if necessary. Of course, the deck needed to be well-rounded, and as a result runs no less than 12 burn spells with an additional 4 Mog Fanatics, but also provides the attack power that I had been missing last time. The sideboard also does something that is a bit of a different tactic than most. Well, most times decks will say, this deck has something to do with game 1, so let it do something, and then board in the 10 cards necessary if they're necessary for games 2 and 3. This deck instead says something along the lines of, this deck has 75% of the basis that you want to cover and work off of, and some of its what it means to do bases can be combined, but for the times that it doesn't synergize, I take out 25% of the deck that I don't need and put in the 25% I do need. I can't argue that this strategy is better, but it is, in my opinion, a little more obvious for what you're going to do in putting in game 2 and 3. For example, let's say about 70% of your deck is the main focus on burn and aggressive basis, then another 15% of the deck focuses on stopping the opponent's counterspells and what I want to drop, then the remaining 15% focuses on shutting down your opponent's lands that they need access to for mana sources, i.e. reflecting pools. Of course, these percentages will be a little bit off, but for now we'll assume that those percentages are spot on. So if this is true, then game 1 should easily take down fairies. A little less so is true for 5-color control, and a little less so is true for the big aggro decks, such as Doran or Elves in some cases. Let's assume you lose all of those games, however. Against the fairies and 5-color players, assuming the fairies player is playing enough non-basic lands, you'll want to definitely board in the Fulminator Mages and 2 Guttural responses, most likely for the Ashenmoor Gougers, as this will gear to the tempo of the 5-color control decks and fairy decks, which you can then spend more time burning in the end, rather than playing spells that get cryptic commanded, in which case they also get to draw a card. You'll also need to gauge, once again, depending on the deck, how many Pyroclasms to board in. This also works the opposite way for the more aggressive decks that don't run Mutavault, meaning that you will want to board out the Fulminator Mages and Shushers for something more aggressive like Shocks and Magma Sprays for the Kithkin and Kitchen Finks players, as well as the Pyroclasms, despite the fact that it doesn't have nearly as much potential as Sulphurous Blast. But that's my own fetish anyway. But there are still 3 more decks to cover, so let's move on. This build's by Dan Boucher. While there have been about a dozen different variants, including Esper Charms and Grixis Charms, I will warn you not to play these. Why? Well, I mean, it's nice to have the additional Esper Charm in the mirror match, but quite frankly, having more cards that do basically nothing but slow down the game or act as slowly cards that just draw other cards for 3 mana? And while Grixis Charm can act as a phenomenal kill spell and bounce spell, there are multiple better options, including Agony Warp over Grixis Charm, Jace Beleren over Esper Charm, or just plain old Cryptic Command and 56 other cards to replace just about anything. However, these types of decks have not only better replacements, but also almost always stop someone from playing a 4th turn Cryptic Command, or require 4 more X Reflecting Pools for a team to have in their playset, or just stop someone from playing 4 Mutavaults altogether. A long not thought about hard that we couldn't possibly mull over until 5-color monstrosities rolled around, and said that we could play anything and everything we wanted, except for the colorless cards. Go figure. As for Fairies matches, they aren't the most preferable in the current field, as it can be hated out, but then again, its resilient ability that says, counter, 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 get a creature, counter, is a bit of a pain and crazy resilient. And as always, Fairies has managed to take down multiple 5Ks in the past, so expect to see this Tina everywhere at your regionals. Finally, as we wrap up the decks this week, while running a bit low on the time, we see these 2 aggro decks that are variants of a great deal of others, being Kithkin and Elves.
When he said said that it was deja vu. But he 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 said that it was deja vu.
Both decks act much in the same way, usually losing to fairies in one sense and beating it in another, as the same goes for 5-color and red deck wins. But then again, isn't that what's so great about these two decks? They test more so the play skill of the player than the deck itself, as Charles Gindy showed us. And as for the lowdown of these decks, you'll have to play them to gear up. So until next time when we head to States, this is the Card Professor tapped out for now, but we'll be back soon.
Barack Obama will be the 44th President of the United States.